Hey everybody, and Happy New Year to you. This course is launching in January of 2026. So, if you're watching this as it's coming out, it's the new year. And so, this material felt very relevant to share with the group because it's really substantial in terms of the impact that it can have on how you move through the world going forward. Even if you don't end up applying all of this step by step, just what this material will expose you to in terms of your perspective of decision making, I think will open up something for you, right? Even if you've encountered some of this, it's unlikely that you've encountered all of this in one cohesive, unified, coherent whole that this course will deliver. So, with that said, I'm really excited to share this. This material has actually been cooking inside of me for years. And funny enough, there was actually another version of this course that I completely recorded. And then when it was done, I felt like it just wasn't ready. And I still have 3 hours, something like that, of material set aside that was the original version of this, and I never shared it publicly because I really wanted this to be super helpful when it did actually go out and to be something that people could apply. Because the notion of decision making and wayfinding is perhaps central to the lived experience, because every moment, in a sense, is a choice that we are making. And where we find ourselves and what we're doing could be largely, to some degree, connected to the choices that we're making. I mean, our choices don't exist in a vacuum, and we're not the only being making choices that affect the outcome of our lives, as you'll see throughout the course, but certainly we're playing a big role in what's occurring through our decision making process. And decision making, in and of itself, has always been a core focus of the human experience, and you can find how that shows up, this core focus idea, in indigenous and tribal cultures when it comes to how they went about making decisions. And like everything else, humans in the modern world are often divorced from the tribal and indigenous and historical ancestral context that was present in, well, pretty much almost every area of our life, and that includes how we go about making decisions. And modern people, I think, take the decision-making process for granted. A lot of people don't even realize that there is a whole scope of potential context, cosmology, and practice that could go into making better decisions. And this isn't like about optimization or, that kind of thought process. It's about coherence, alignment, and trajectory through life in a way that is more whole, more synchronized, and more holistic, and that is leading us somewhere that is not completely random or based in impulsive and reactive decisions, which is where most people are coming from in the decision making process most of the time. Or, for that matter, they are completely asleep at the wheel, right? There's just not true engagement of conscious participation when we are moving through life for the most part. And this is how people, get stuck in ruts and or just meander along instead of feeling like they're engaged with the unfolding of life. So with that said, we're going to move into multiple layers of understanding with wayfinding. And that's going to start off, without further ado, with exploring decision making within the context of an axis. And that is something that we can map onto a graph of infinite possibility and limited probability. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so here we have a graph that outlines this axis of the intersection between infinite possibility and limited probability. And when we're making choices of any kind, they are occurring within this dynamic. And this is going to be a little bit more of a theoretical side of this particular presentation that helps establish the scope of what we're dealing with. And then we'll move on to more practical layers as we continue. But for right now, this is an important graph to understand. And we're going to explore this graph in future presentations that have to do with fate and destiny, because fate and destiny also exist in the context of this. One could actually say that destiny is the vertical axis of possibility, and fate is the horizontal axis of probability. And when we are transmuting fate into destiny, we're moving up this ladder towards more of this central position that you could see where we have high possibility and high probability. But for now, we're not going to dive into that because it's its own presentation. But I did want to kind of point that out for people who are interested in understanding the intersection of fate and destiny. But for right now, let's consider the fact that we exist within an infinite possibility dimension. Whatever we call this world is one that is full of infinite possibility insofar as we can tell. And at the same time, we're within limited probability. So even though the field of possibility is wide open, the field of probability is not. It is actually rather constrained and closed. This can be shifted, of course, but nonetheless, it is currently always a limiting factor. That is what's most probable to happen next based off of what has already occurred. So, fascinatingly enough, most people think about possibility when we say infinite possibility and some really new agey like protracted, convoluted, extracted pattern or something like really theoretical and lofty. And I want to completely ground that notion into something that's super practical. And I'm going to use an example that I have used before because it's very fitting and super funny, right? So right now, if you look at a wall inside the room that you're in and think to yourself, how many ways could I possibly put a hole into that wall? Now, why am I saying that? Well, because it's very practical. For one, is like you could stand up right now and you could go punch it. You could kick it. You could elbow it. You could jump and punch it. You could jump and elbow it. You could jump and kick it. You could pick up something in the room and smash it. I mean, all of the things potentially in your room. Like, how many things could you pick up that are in your room right now and go and smash the wall with it? Now, where do you smash it? Do you smash it like in the corner next to the floor, or up in the corner next to the ceiling, or in the center, or where? I mean, there's so many different places on that wall, anywhere on that wall potentially. You could put a hole in it with any potential thing in your room or with your body in any kind of pattern. And you could change the size of that hole to be, dimensionally like at a super fine level of, inches or centimeters or millimeters, different sizes. The holes could take on an infinite amount of shapes because no two holes would probably be perfectly exactly the same with what you currently have available to you. So just within that super limited context, think about how many millions, if not potentially infinite amount of iterations the putting of a hole in your wall can take. And this goes to the idea that within limitation, within some kind of finite boundary, there is already infinity within it. One great example I've heard of this is if you take a triangle, for example, in a computer, right? Like you create a two-dimensional triangle and you have a computer that's strong enough to continue doing this forever, you ask it to make a triangle that's just ever so slightly smaller than the first one to fit inside the first one, and you continue that process forever. It could go on continuing for eternity, making smaller and smaller and smaller triangles within the original finite space. So same idea here, right? There is infinite possibility there. Now, let's extrapolate that completely out into the zone of what you could be doing in the world right now. It's infinite. And there's the reality, though, that the choices that occurred before you were born at an ancestral level and that have led into you being here and now watching or listening to this presentation have limited that scope of what you could be doing to what you are doing now, right? So, I mean, instead of being, at an underground, card game in a basement in Hong Kong or in a temple in Tibet, in front of a Buddhist monastery, right, or a Buddhist statue, chanting or whatever, you're here and now because of the stream of choices that you have made. And, of course, as I said before too, like that other forces are making around you because your decisions don't exist in a vacuum, but we'll get to that a little bit later in more detail. So right now though, let's jump from that idea of being able to put a bunch of holes in a wall just to illuminate the fact that infinite possibility is true. And, throw a little kind of like a little wrench into that and say, the probability of you wanting to put a hole in your wall is probably rather low, right? But nonetheless, it's possible. Now, let's completely shift gears and now think of two musicians that you appreciate and who have worked together at some point in the past. For whatever reason, my mind ends up going to Alicia Keys and Usher, right? Now, that's not everybody's go-to, and some people may not even know who they are. But, consider two famous musicians, and that they've worked together, that they know each other. And now, I want you to consider the fact that it is possible that in a week, you could be hanging out with them and recording a song. Is that possible? Of course, within the realm of possibility. There's nothing completely stopping that, right? It's possible. But how probable is it? Extremely low, right? To the point where it's almost not even worth considering as a possibility. Okay, and now the reason for bringing up two singers as opposed to one is to point out a very simple dynamic. And that is the possibility of you and one of these recording artists getting together in the next week to record a song exists in equal possibility to them calling the other to get together to sing a song in the next week. Both are equally possible within the context of reality, and there's nothing stopping either one of those things from being more possible. But when you get down to it, probability plays a major constraining role around which of these is most likely to occur, because of a wide variety of circumstances from the past that have shaped what is going to potentially occur more likely in the future. And this goes back even to ancestry and the ability that each of these two singers that you might be imagining acquired in terms of the body's ability to sing at that level. And then the fated life circumstances and the work that went into cultivating a particular talent over many years have all shaped the current of probability. So even though we do live in a universe of infinite possibility, because of the nature of probability, one has to acknowledge the power of limitation in the choices that we are going to make. So now we have two extremes, right, that have very stark differences to each other in what they illuminate. In one context, you have infinite possibility, and in another context, you have very limited probability. Now, the real question is, where do those things start to meet together, and where do they deviate from each other? In stark contrast, meaning that there are things in life, there are decisions we could make that exist on this vertical axis of high possibility, right? There are things that are so possible. It's like, whoa, we could do this, right? You know, this is available to me within the realm of what's possible. And then there's this other side, which is that the probability of some things occurring are super, super, super low and high at the same time, meaning like that there's a constraint around what you want to do. So something you might want to do, some decision you might want to make has a super low probability of occurring. And other things that are in line, right, the path you're taking, that is kind of feels like it's cemented in place to some degree, is possibly where there's a super high probability of something occurring simultaneously, right? The probabilities they're shaping both in what could happen and what can't happen. And now, when we are making decisions, they're occurring within this field of possibility and probability. And good decision making has to take all of this into account, because there are layers in which certain decisions we might want to make will be fighting probability to such a degree that it's going to feel like we are just taking damage in the process of trying to shift it. At the same time, if we're not noticing the possibilities that are available to us, then we might be playing within a probability field that is not truly aligned with our destiny, right? With that place where possibility starts to come into play, right? Where choice starts to come into play, where the creative potential for our life starts to come into place. So solid decision making takes all of this into account and will have to teeter with these different aspects of choice. So do you accept, for example, that certain probabilities are just what they are? That is, certain things are fated, and that's just not worth fighting. And or where do you start to go after possibilities that truly speak to you as a whole, at the soul level, at the heart level, at an integrated being level, which we'll talk about the integrated piece later because it's really important. And a lot of really solid decisions will be moving towards this high possibility, high probability zone, where both of these factors are being taken into account. Not always, but it's worth noting that that is kind of like the ideal zone to be working toward. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. All right, so now let's explore the primary challenges that we encounter in the decision-making process that prevent us from consistently moving along this axis we were speaking of possibility and probability in a way that is conscious and participatory, right? Because if there's one thing we could say that high quality decision making is characterized by, its conscious active participation. Although we are going to explore also the various qualities of solid decision making in a little bit. For now, though, let's look at what does not allow us to do that on a consistent basis. And one of the ways I really like to frame this is who gets to choose. Now, as I said, most modern people are coming at the decision-making process completely asleep at the wheel, in the sense of they are not engaging consciously with the process, because for one, they don't have maps for it, so it's not by any means a criticism. It's that these maps don't exist and we're not taught how to do this. And it's just what it is. But a key piece to this is to understand that right now your system is structured a certain way, right? So wayfinding is about moving through a landscape. It's a term that has to do with navigation and navigating through terrain. So if you were to imagine, let's say, a city right now, a city has a very established way through it, right? That's a big part of what streets and roads and signs are all about. They are doing wayfinding for you so that you follow the established paths for the most part. Now, most people, well, really all of us to some degree or another, are existing in a structure like that when it comes to wayfinding, right? There are things already in place that frame how we will move through life for the most part. And some of these are personal in the sense of, the responses that you as a being have had to what has occurred, or the reactions, reactions and responses, but also, as I was saying, fated circumstances, right? Your ancestral line to some degree and the body that you've inherited and what that body wants to do and how it's orientated, because that plays a huge role in what we consider to be attractive or repellent through life. A very genetically gifted body might feel a way stronger draw to, let's say, athletic activity in the context of professional athletes, for example, than, say, someone who isn't. Or someone who has a body very predisposed to psychic phenomenon might feel much more pulled into fields like, spirituality, philosophy, therapy. And those don't always intersect and often don't, yeah? They kind of almost often lead in two different directions. Not exclusively. There are people who can have a more holistic orientation, but those contrasts do exist. Just as a stark example of ancestral inheritance, just from the bodily level, then where you were born, and what belief structures exist in your family, what stories they're carrying that are transferred to you, that shapes this structure inside of you that has these paths already kind of laid out. Then the culture that you were born in and how it orientates, and how, for example, Western people might have a very different orientation. Even European people versus American people have these different orientations. And all of that starts to structure how you perceive, right? So that's an important consideration, is there's already this structure inside of you. But within that structure, now we're going to start to move away from that metaphor, which is just to help you understand wayfinding through like architecture, and that you have an architecture inside of you already that's been shaped by a variety of factors, to this idea of who gets to choose, meaning what part of you makes a decision. Because humans are not a singular entity in the sense of that there is one single source of decision making. There's actually many. We are chimerical in the sense that we have many different parts, right? Many different heads, so to speak, that can make decisions, and many different things that we are using as road signs to orientate in the process. And most of these, for most people, are completely unchosen, for the most part. And if you do have a very solidly chosen set of circumstances around this, then that's awesome, you are in the minority. But I want to point out perhaps one of the biggest roadblocks that people have in their decision-making process, right? One of the things that most gets in the way, or that's a feature, and that is fragmentation and trauma, right? So fragmentation means that there are many different parts inside of you that are not communicating with each other and that hijack you, so to speak, hijack your vehicle on the road in the process of making decisions. So this could easily be, the part of you that wants one thing, right, to let's say lose 30 pounds, has to continuously contend with the part of you that wants to eat chocolate cake. For an example, a super small and super simple example that can be extrapolated to the larger decision-making process, in the sense that most people have parts inside of them that want different things. They are fragmented. They are not cohered as one unified whole together, moving forward as a unit. And this is where things like parts work comes into play, and family systems, internal family systems, if you've ever heard of that system, and if not, it's worth looking up. Internal family systems, it's a way of orientating towards parts work. And parts work in that way is something that allows the different aspects of you to start to get in line with one another. Now, what most people don't realize also is that each and every single part inside of you is a fractal representation of the whole, meaning that each part has the full spectrum of what is allowed for a human to feel present, though very nuanced to them, right? To what they want. So one way to think about this is like if you're familiar with the 7 chakras, right? As a model, if you like that model, right? One way to think of it is that each part has all 7 chakras, right? And that's for every single part inside of us. That means that they're all orientated a different way towards all of these things, and there's a different configuration of open and closed chakras, of how much energy there is in either one, etc. So when you're dealing with a part, you're dealing with an entirety in and of itself that has its own kind of say in things, which is why they can be so difficult to deal with at times. And in that sense, trauma, right, is one of the layers of this. And I often think of them as very, very congruent with each other, what we might call fragmentation and trauma, because trauma is fragmenting fundamentally. Now, trauma as a whole, I'm actually going to probably do a presentation on trauma, is something that has been, I think, misrepresented a lot. And there's a lot of things that get labeled as trauma, which I think is a mistake for the most part, from a purely functional perspective in terms of labeling and identifying different phenomenon. For the most part, though, what I want to orientate you towards in terms of trauma today, just for the sake of this presentation, to keep this concise, is that we're talking about loops stuck in the past fundamentally, right? It's stuff that's occurring, not present time, right? It's patterns that were catalyzed at one point in the past and that have remained in a loop, and they are self-contained in a sense of being connected to that time. So in a sense, it fragments us at the level of time, because instead of being able to be fully present here and now, there's parts of us that are resonating with a different time. So we're fragmented in that way. And often parts will have a strong resonance with these loops in terms of what they're trying to get us to do, right? Like a lot of parts form or are shaped by these kind of time loops that we often call trauma. So there is that, right? That fragmentation and trauma make a major role. So in a sense, who gets to choose when you encounter a decision in life that is big and important? And or even small decisions on a day-to-day basis. Do I eat that chocolate cake? Or do I, stay to my dietary discipline, right? Small choices even. Who's making that choice fundamentally? Is it a super traumatized part, right? Who sees the chocolate cake as some kind of strategy for something that makes sense to it for whatever reason? If I lose a bunch of weight, then I'll lose my partner or something like that, because then I'll look good or something, or vice versa. I don't want a partner because that's dangerous, so let me keep 30 pounds extra on me, whatever the case may be, right? So who gets to make the choice, right? And this is going to tie into what we're going to explore as we continue. But keep that in mind. Fragmentation and trauma are huge. Now, moving on to incoherent worldview and world sense. So, cosmologically, most of us have cobbled together cosmologies, right? Because the world today is very cobbled together in the sense that it's very syncretic and eclectic in terms of perspective, right? We all encounter, and if you're in the modern world, you encounter narratives that have to do with Christianity and Catholicism and the Abrahamic traditions, without a doubt. You also encounter stuff that comes from scientific perspectives. If you watch TV, if you listen to songs, you encounter so many different philosophies and worldviews, and people will often grab on little metaphors, right? Oh, this metaphor, this, or this, line here, it made sense to me, or this perspective about life, that you encounter these little ideas that people share in movies and TV and all that stuff all the time, right? And your other than conscious mind will grab onto those and will start to build a worldview. We're patching together our sense of a cosmology. Then there's scientism, there's the left leaning philosophies, the liberal philosophies, and then there's conservative, right leaning philosophies in America. There's different political parties everywhere that people exist. Then for people like us who are practitioners, if you're watching this, you likely are. You're also exploring different philosophies from different traditions, so Taoism, Tantra, psychology, and modern Western, like depth, archetypal explorations of the psyche. And you might be encountering, magical traditions of different kinds. So, you're actually encountering so many different things that are all patched together often. And a lot of these things actually don't cohere with each other. They're not congruent with each other. They're not all, creating a unified whole. They're more like a Frankenstein style system. And that's nearly unavoidable to some degree in today's world. But what is valuable is to recognize that that's happening and to realize that the worldview, which is very visual, right? In the sense of how we see the world, carries with it a corresponding world sense. It's how that view is represented somatically inside of our being and what that feels like to us. And the fragmentation in the sense, or the incoherence that exists at that level of philosophy of life, right? So there's perhaps parts of you, or parts of your worldview, right? And those things kind of connect together, right? That feel and perceive that certain things are available to you, like thriving, flourishing, blossoming. And then there's other parts that actually have a very cynical aspect to them, right? In the sense of, you've gathered pieces from some philosophy that the world is hard, that the world is difficult, and you can't have those things. And so then those philosophies, those worldviews, those world senses, they start to clash with each other. Yeah. And this is a big part of also what's happening is, which path are you taking at any given moment that will compound into a particular outcome. Then something called reactionary North Stars, right? So a North Star is something that I talk about a lot, and I'm also going to do a presentation on North Stars soon and how to establish them. And specifically, what a very congruent set of North Stars is for modern humans, from my perspective. But for now, right, reactionary North Stars are the things that... So, okay, actually, let me step back. A North Star is something that we choose to establish direction. It is something that allows us to create a compass of orientation, right? And if we're heading north, which, for the sake of this example, or this metaphor, it's useful to think, hey, I'm heading north. Then it helps us orientate towards something, right? to head towards something. We never arrive at a North Star, though, right? Because a North Star is in space. It just helps us move in a particular direction and orientate. So the point being that a North Star is something that we are heading towards and that helps us orientate. And many people have reactionary North Stars that result from fragmentation and trauma. And possibly, we could say, incoherent worldviews and world senses. Really, they could emerge out of anything, right? Out of all these different layers that we're exploring now for the most part. It's not helpful to try to like tease apart these exact things, just helpful to know that they exist. Reactionary North Stars, meaning that they're not chosen, they're reactive, right? So, chocolate cake example. For whatever reason, person can't seem to get in line with not eating the chocolate cake, right? Some part inside has taken over that part of the decision-making process for you, and its North Star is reactionary, probably, in the sense that something happened at some point in the past that created some kind of an inner structure where what makes sense to do is to head towards, having more weight on you than not. Now, this is not a criticism of anyone who does have more weight on them. It's just an example of how decisions are made at a very practical level, right? Small, practical, day-to-day stuff that we all kind of deal with to some degree. You can extrapolate this to anything that you continuously are having trouble with, engaging with, right? Where one part of you wants something, another part doesn't, and the part of you that doesn't want it takes over, right? So we're full of these, right? These reactionary North Stars, and even stuff that comes from, again, culture and civilization, right? And ancestral patterns. These things that are unconsciously chosen as orientations, the American dream, consumerism, whatever the case may be, right? We're told that we're supposed to want these things, and then parts of us, they choose these stars based off these reactions. They're not consciously chosen stars to focus on. They emerge out of these worldviews and world senses that are incoherent. So these are happening all the time, right? And exploring those is super helpful. Okay. Now let's go to another one, which is limited scope of perception. That means that you have blind spots. So fundamentally, within the context of what we're already talking about, fragmentation, trauma, incoherent worldview and world sense, reactionary North Stars, you also fundamentally have a limited scope of perception, right? Like there's stuff that you're just not noticing and not seeing that exist, right? There are things that you just don't know are occurring. It's just that simple. Or how your choices will interact with all the other choices that are occurring around you in this ocean of choices. They're called blind spots too, right? So, there's just things that are occurring underneath the surface of your awareness. And that is an important consideration, especially when we get to, what one of the main wayfinding things that I suggest in terms of practice, which is divination, right? Because divination means that you're stepping outside the scope of your perception in order to encounter forces and beings that have a broader or different mode of perception than you do and can see blind spots that you can't. So there's that. Now, let's get to the next piece, right? Because that ties into what I just shared about divination and beings and forces that have a different perspective than you do, and that's a populated universe of competing agenda. Now, modern world would have us believe that, there's just a bunch of random forces that are materialistic and have no consciousness, and, the spirits and entities don't really exist outside the context of what's physically visible and etc., right? The very materialistic modern sense of the world. Now, if you go back to a tribal and indigenous context, that's actually not the way that the universe was apprehended. More so, we were dealing with a populated universe of different agendas, right? This is represented in the cosmology of all the pantheons of gods that you encounter in the old world, where different gods want different things. And they're arguing with each other, fighting with each other, and getting into dramas and jealousies and all this stuff, right? At one level, that's just simply showing you that the creative forces of the universe in that sense are not particularly singular, and that the universe is populated with agenda. Now, aside from gods, right? Setting that aside, you're talking about all kinds of entities, from ancestral forces to parasitic beings to dark beings to light beings that have, a more benevolent agenda on humanity, to now even stepping outside of that to forces of nature, to the earth itself, right? And its consciousness and its choices. And your choices exist in the context of all that. Not to mention, of course, almost forgot, right? Because more obvious, but sometimes not even remembered, there are 8 billion people on this planet making choices, right? So your choices are occurring in the context of all of those choices too. Now, more important, I think, for this discussion is the non-embodied entities that are making choices on this planet, and that you are a part of one way or another, whether you like it or not. The fact is, these choices are being made, and you exist within the effect of those choices, within the ripples of the ocean of the choices being made by many different kinds of entities and beings in this world, right? So divination is a way to begin to factor in those types of choices with your choices. Because you might want something, but you're inside an ecology or a ripple effect so strong that you can't get out of it. Or that the way to surf these ripples is not going to be obvious to you unless you're divine. So divination is definitely a big one. And it's also a reason why pretty much every single indigenous and tribal culture that has existed, and even traditional cultures, we're talking about, agrarian, cultures, had divination systems, right? That's, humans today don't divine, and that's fine. You don't have to, but human civilization and as a whole, human society as a whole, has often congregated around divination, and that's been the case for a very, very, very long time. So, just putting that out there. Now, with that said, there is also taking into account fate and destiny, and whether or not you are working within the scope of that, right? So, again, this goes back to probability in terms of, fate being like what's super already, like high probability and low probability for you, and understanding that. And then which stream of possibility is available to you within the context of that. Because, again, infinite possibility doesn't mean anything. You can do anything. It means that anything can be done, right? It's a different kind of orientation. But within that, there's still always probability occurring within it, right? So the stream of what's possible, like if you want to say like there's this vast field of possibility, the roads into it are in a sense shaped and limited to some degree of what is possible with a connection to what's probable, right? So keep that in mind. But if you're fighting fate and destiny, that's a tough thing to do. Believe me, I know, because I have done it a lot, and more than I wish, more than I would like to admit. And I have really tested the boundaries of that, and I can tell you that they are a factor, and they are worth keeping in mind. And then finally, timing. And that is that you might want to do something, or not want to do something for that matter, but timing is a role. Timing is a huge factor because some things are just not ready to occur at certain times. And, when you take astrology into account, for example, like the understanding that astrology is time, space, animism, means that different times and spaces, wherever we are right now in time and space, have different things that are more congruent in those times and spaces. So, because each time and space is ruled by a different kind of energetic force. Now, this is something that shows up in all different forms of astrology around the world. People hear like the year of the dragon, right? Well, that means that from a Chinese perspective, right, they have mapped that cyclical time space, that chunk of time and space in the context of a cycle as the dragon of a particular element. That means that that time and space all over us has a particular kind of energetic charge that it is congruent and resonant with, and certain actions can occur within those time spaces more easily for some people, right? Or not, and be much more harder for some people. So that is a factor, is timing. And even your own timing is your own unfolding. Certain things can be accessible or blocked at certain times. And that's just a factor to take into account. So just because something isn't available now doesn't mean it won't be available later. So keep that in mind. So these are the challenges that we are dealing with, and that's already a pretty broad scope of things to take into account in the context of decision making. Okay, so now let's move into wayfinding in an ancient context, just to establish ancestral reference points here, because it helps us to also realize the disconnect that we currently have with our own decision-making process at the level of the modern human. So, for one, ancient cultures were way more embodied fundamentally than we are today, right? So that helps because the body has a unique capacity to consolidate many different layers in a way that's extremely intelligent and give us very simple feedback in terms of knowing and feeling that helps us orientate through time and space, right? The body is capable of processing a lot of the complexity that the conscious mind often can't, because the body is, incredibly intelligent, right? What the body is doing at the level of, function, like the billions, if not trillions, of processes that are occurring every second in a symphonic whole that is responsive to both the past, present, and in some ways the future all together is just amazing, phenomenal, right? Beyond anything that you can conceptualize. So the body is incredibly intelligent. And it can process a lot of this information. But the problem with the body, for most modern people in that way, is that we have the fragmentation, we have the trauma, we have the disembodiment layers, we have disconnecting from the body, we have not trusting in the body, we have signals, being off and being able to interpret those signals are off. But nonetheless, when you look at ancient cultures, you saw that they were typically more embodied cultures. And the bodies themselves were very congruent with ancestral inheritance, right? So, meaning that bodies were living in line with the way that the human animal was designed to live for a baseline, right? So, ancient people already had that anchor way more clean, with way more coherent signal, and way more trust in the physical experience that were playing a part in the decision-making process. So, one. Two, less trauma, fundamentally, right? So, ancient people lived in such a way that the amount of trauma that they would accumulate would be far less than modern people. This is actually an article that I wrote a long time ago called The Great Backlog of Trauma, right? Meaning that modern culture has divorced us from the life ways of indigenous people and tribal people, that way of life, at baseline, would carry with it far less opportunity to get stuck in these painful time loops. And if we did, the way of life itself would often discharge the trauma. For all sorts of reasons, including that they lived in true communities that were bonded and supportive, that a lot of personal trauma was often held in a communal container, right? So it wasn't just yours to deal with. It was considered the tribe's responsibility, in a sense, to help you deal with. You were fundamentally already supported. You had clean, healthy ancestral lines, so there was a lot less ancestral baggage coming through. Physical bodies were, again, allowed to exist in a much more harmonious relationship with the land. Had way more movement and physicality in that way, right? They were consistently getting into deep flow states because they were in nature, and I've talked about this before. Flow, because it brings you fully into the moment as a way of discharging, these time loops that are stuck in the past, or even, I guess technically you could have a time loop stuck in the future if you're like just constantly projecting out into the future, right? But whatever. They would engage with plant medicines from time to time, ritual and ceremony. All of these things would continuously help people layer back into the moment and deal with fragmentation and trauma. Now, you also had councils of elders, people who, were practiced at a particular way of life. It's really hard to find elders. It's one of the things I want to talk about, because we often think of elders as like people who are older than us, and that's fair enough. And then there's this other idea that an elder is somebody who, has been initiated into elderhood, and that's fair enough too. But another way to think of an elder is somebody who's further along a particular path that you are, right? And so in a tribal and indigenous context, the path is set, right? People are living a particular way of life. So an elder is somebody who's lived in that particular way of life for longer than you have, right? So the goals of the tribe are the same, right? For everybody, typically, to some degree or another, there's a coherence in the tribe. So, a council of elders is a group of elders who represent usually some kind of diverse set of people within the context of a tribe already. And then, they congregate with each other and come into resonance with each other in order to make decisions for a group. We don't have that, right? We're mostly on our own, or we end up trusting all these major institutions, which I suggest not for the most part. Then again, we have coherent worldview and world sense, right? Because tribal and indigenous people and traditional cultures even, right? They have a coherent sense and view of the world, right? They have a world view that is total and contained. They exist within a cosmology. They're not interacting with a ton of different cosmologies, right? It's not like, oh, I'm getting science here and Abrahamic tradition there and materialism here and Stoic philosophy there and Taoist philosophy here and tantric philosophy there, and what this movie and TV show said over here. It's not all of that, right? It's the stories and the life ways of a particular people, coagulated and refined over generations, stable, congruent with your genetics, all of that stuff, right? So decision-making changes in that context too. And then you have supportive ancestors. So one of the things, we could say so much about all of this, but one of the things that is important to understand is that, probability, a big part of the probability current, the fate current, is ancestral. You could almost say it's entirely ancestral if you take the vantage point that the ancestral is everything and everyone that has come before you, right? So from that standpoint, the fate field and the ancestral field are very resonant with each other, right? So when you have a supportive ancestral current, you have the wind at your back, so to speak, guiding you, supporting you, helping you, wanting you to move towards thriving and flourishing, because that's what the ancestors want, right? Because that's what life wants. Life wants to thrive. Life wants to flourish. You give any life on this planet, except for maybe humans because they get so much shit in their heads. The resources necessary, it's a tree, right? A vegetation in like a tropical zone, right? That just goes boom, grows, blossoms, flourishes, expands, gets dense, thick, heavy. If it's a cat that you feed a lot, right? It'll keep eating the food and it's just happy, right? Like if you give resources, enough resources, things want to thrive. It's an impulse in life to thrive. One could say it is the impulse, even more I think than survival, but that's debatable and a question for another day, and even just something to converse around whether or not survival and thriving are like equally, which one's more important. But you could say the one's stacked on top of the other, right? Because you have to survive in order to thrive. But anyway, that's a tangent for another day. But yeah, if you have supportive ancestors, that helps a lot. And also that means that, hungry ghosts aren't affecting your decision-making process and trying to live through you, which is a factor. Now, there's also oracular wisdom. Tribal and indigenous cultures, as I said, they divine. There's divination. They're consistently and in an ongoing way talking to spiritual forces that they trust in a ritualized container that allows them to make better decisions, right? That's core feature of being human, is oracular engagement. So being able to consistently engage with oracles that you trust, huge, super valuable. And imperfect, like everything else, but nonetheless extremely valuable. Now, it doesn't have to be like a physical oracle, in the sense of, like cards or something like that. It could be astrology, right? Astrology was originally created to predict events and make decisions. So you have entire cultures that spent generations staring at the sky, mapping patterns just to know how to make better decisions, right? And today, if we know where to look, we have access to a ton of astrological insight and foresight. So nonetheless, ancient cultures were making oracular decisions all the time. And then ritual cultures. So ritual in and of itself is a container that establishes a time-space configuration that allows you to connect to broader forces than you. So, everyday life, we're in a particular frame of mind, moving through the world, one might call it ordinary consciousness, right? And it's like, I need to do this, I need to go there, this thing's happening here, I'm on the computer now, I'm driving a car here, blah, blah, blah. It's all very narrow in scope. Rituals, they usually connect you to something bigger, some kind of deeper metaphorical or mythical or spiritual truth and power grid, so to speak, right? So that could be something archetypal, right? That you're engaging in some kind of archetypal process where you're, banishing something, removing something, right? Those are big archetypal forces. Or calling something in, or realigning something, or, asking for something that you want, right? In the sense of like practical magic, like please send me here towards good health or thriving or whatever the case may be. So rituals, they help us continuously align ourselves with a better possibility, probability current. And they help us bypass a lot of the issues in terms of like fragmentation and trauma and worldview and all that stuff. And ritual cultures, indigenous and tribal cultures are ritual cultures. So, here is the context that ancient cultures existed within when they were making decisions. Now, mirror that to your own world and your own life and ask yourself, how in line is it with that? For most people, it sure as hell isn't, right? And that's it is what it is, right? Hopefully, this material can help you kind of get better in line with the context that decision making was occurring in the past. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so now that we have gone and established an ancestral context for decision making, and we get a sense of how these ancient cultures and ancient peoples were making decisions, or the environment, so to speak, that surrounded their decision making process, it's helpful to measure our own process against that. Because what we have when we observe the way that ancient peoples did something is usually, at least in broad scope, right? Like you could always look at a culture and pick out very nuanced and idiosyncratic faculties and processes that are specific to that culture, which might represent something weird that doesn't really have much to do with these archetypal processes that we're discussing. But aside from trying to be nitpicky about these things, looking at the general overall dynamics and archetypal elements present in the context of ancient decision making, especially hunter-gatherer lineages and then some of the more early traditional cultures, what we encounter is something that was refined over countless generations to be a viable and useful and proven way of orientating around decisions. Not only that, but it was and is fundamentally a representation of the human's place in the context of the cosmos and how that works. Because that's what was going on for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, was human beings trying to find their place in the context of the cosmos, and how decisions from humans interacted with this cosmos. So, understanding that there's all this inherited knowledge and wisdom that we can connect to, I want to ask you to measure your own decision-making process against those contexts. So, with that in place, what I want to do is highlight the qualities that are connected with and associated with and lead to skillful decision-making, working with ancient context as a reference point. So the first one, and this is something that I have spoken about a lot and will continue to speak about because it's an important core feature of eating ancient virtue as a general principle, and that is coherence. Coherence, again, is when all the different layers of something are feeding into one another to create amplitude. So it's a system of different effects, so to speak, coming together to forward feed one another. So think about a symphony, and how in a symphony there are many different instruments that are seeking to be in resonance with each other, even though they're very unique in what they can do. They still can fuse into a unified whole that is greater than the sum of their parts to create beautiful music through resonance, through amplitude, fundamentally. And the opposite of that is also true, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But for right now, coherence talks about how everything can come together in order to unify into a whole that creates momentum and forward feeding and coherence fundamentally. So when we look at the ancient context of our ancestors, and you notice, embodied cultures that have less trauma, so that means less fragmentation, councils of elders that are in resonance with each other or seeking to gain resonance with each other, like a flock of birds kind of talking together at night, unifying the whole community, so to speak, with that resonance. When you look at a coherent worldview where you have one unified way of perceiving the universe as a culture, you have a supportive ancestral line, and then you have oracles that are allowing you to connect to the greater spiritual ecology. An enormous part of what comes out of that whole process is fundamentally coherence. It's a relational resonance that is very total and encompassing of each other as humans, but also then the greater spiritual ecology that people exist within. And from that, you end up getting a sense of centeredness. Right? Centered, referring to this idea. So a center is something that typically holds opposing forces in balance. That's one way to think about a center, is that there are all these different forces that can be peripheral and that can move towards and away from a center, and the center is meant to be the balance point between them, the still point even in some contexts. So when we look at a unified system and we look at resonance and coherence and stability, we are often looking for also a sense of centeredness in the sense of it being stable. And so skillful decision making has a quality of being centered, right? So in an indigenous and tribal context and in a traditional context, important decisions typically were wanting to be made in a more stable context, right? It wasn't like rushed and impulsive and let's push this and let's jam over here and one person wants to do this and another person wants to do that, so let's just kind of throw it all together. It's like, no, it's the whole gets together, it checks, what everybody's thinking, it orientates according to a worldview, it checks in with the spirits, it unifies and it creates this sense of centeredness, right? So quality decisions or skillful decisions come from a sense of centeredness, or at least the more centered you are, typically the better the decision will be. And of course, there's always going to be times where that's not present, right? But it's an ideal that we can measure where we're at against. Of course, now too, thinking about centeredness, we also think about alignment fundamentally, right? So thinking about like a human body as an example, and this is really relevant because an enormous part of how we are orientating is fundamentally through the body. And alignment is where, again, everything is lined up in a particular way in terms of coherence with the whole to create a structure that is centered and that can act and distribute power and force. So from that perspective, again, when we look at all these things we've been talking about, we're getting in alignment with the social context, with the worldview and world sense, with the spiritual forces that surround us, with the constraints of probability and the open field of possibility. There's an alignment that begins to occur. Yeah. So again, these types of decisions have a sense of being aligned. Then deep knowing. So deep knowing is something that we're going to talk about because it's one of the qualities that a lot of these kinds of orientations will trigger. For example, if you are a person who's participating inside of one of these cultures and you go through all of these different steps, you council of elders, oracular wisdom, measuring things against the felt sense of the body, what the worldview and world sense have to say about what is to be done, and then you arrive at these important decisions. Typically, there's going to be a sense of deep knowing. And if there's not deep knowing, there's typically going to be faith, right? And acceptance, which are the last qualities in that sense of having faith and acceptance that the decision that you're making is going to lead towards something auspicious. And, a lot of people these days, they poo-poo away faith and acceptance as important qualities, right? Because our culture doesn't really orientate that way. It has this very, we need to know everything in advance type of quality. But, life would be impossible to navigate without faith, right? I mean, you jump in a car every morning and you have faith that the drivers out there are going to do what they have agreed to do, yeah? You put out classes, for example, if you're a teacher or something like that, because you have faith that, people are going to pay and show up and listen, right? You have faith that, the institution that you're going to school at is going to be there the next day or even for the next 4 years. Faith is an inherent process in human life, right? And with that comes acceptance. And when I want to talk about acceptance, it is kind of multifold here. One is that you can accept the decision, at least in a way that's livable at all these different layers of your being, right? So if there's one part of you that's like, I can't freaking live with this, then maybe it's not a great decision, or you need to step back and address whatever layer that is, whatever part that is that doesn't want to get on board, because eventually it'll create static and dissonance for you, which is the opposite of coherence, right? The less static and dissonance there is in a system, the more coherence it'll have, at least relative to what we're talking about here. So these kinds of qualities, right? Coherence, centered, aligned, deep knowing, faith, acceptance, are features of the skillful decision-making trajectory. And with that, we could also say that they can almost be summed up in this process of conscious active participation. Yeah, we are consciously and actively engaging in the process of making a decision at multiple levels of reality. So that's going to contrast now with the next slide. So the qualities then of unskillful decision making, if we're going to kind of tag them back to back and contrast them as opposites, even though the lived reality of it is always a little bit more nebulous, is, one core feature I want to point out is a sense of impulsiveness and or rushed, right? And we'll talk about them a little bit differently. Impulsive is not the same as impulse, right? And that's what I want to kind of point out, at least in this context, right? We might have primal impulses that arise from the body that want specific things, warmth and food and companionship and thriving and all these things, right? These are primal impulses. Now, impulsive is, in this context, feeling like you're being hijacked, right? Like you don't have conscious active participation, like some aspect inside of you, or even perhaps an ancestral voice, or even some kind of entity that has attached itself to you, whatever the case may be. It doesn't feel like you're conscious and active and a participant. It feels like something took over and that you're just being pushed into some kind of a reactive pattern, basically, or a reactive decision. So that is typically a quality of unskillful decision making. Now, there are exceptions to this, right? Like everything, you could find exceptions. Maybe there is a being that you trust and that you have an ongoing relationship with, if you work with spiritual entities, for example, that is grabbing a hold of you and preventing you from doing something that's not going to work out for you in the long term. That is a possibility. That takes some nuanced and subtle reflection. And also, of course, at some level, I would suggest that you would have an agreement, so to speak, with that spirit in terms of you allowing it to do that for you. If not, then you might want to rearrange y'all's relationship. But besides that, right, typically that kind of reactive impulsiveness is not very useful. With that said, rushed, right? And by rushed, I don't necessarily mean quick, right? Quick decisions are absolutely feasible, right? So, I mean, do we go here or do we go there? And I know I want to go there. So that's cool, right? If you know, there's a sense of deep knowing about that, right? Even if it's not like super deep, there's a sense of I know. And with that, then no problem. Go ahead and make that decision. But rushed is more so an inner sense, right? That you're not settled about something and that you need time in order to process it. Now, this can be a little bit different than like analysis paralysis, which if you are really in that, like going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, then you're not really also in the proper kind of decision-making context, because that's more like anxiousness or needing certainty, which is one of the qualities of unskillful decision-making, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But more so just an authentic sense of needing time, right? Because high-quality decisions typically arise out of, again, all these other qualities we talked about, and none of those are congruent with a sense of being rushed and that the process of decision-making is unfinished. With that said, incoherence, right? So static and dissonance and different parts wanting different things in a way that is too drastic to allow, right? I mean, all of us might have a little part that says, well, I'm not really so sure about this. And another, but then many parts that go like, hey, this is happening. And then the part that says, goes like, okay, I'm gonna succumb, so to speak. I'm gonna follow and acquiesce with the larger totality. That's cool. That happens all the time. And really, decisions would be impossible without that, because that's occurring all the time. But when you have like serious incoherence, that's something to pay attention to, right? Like just some major decision that doesn't make sense for your life, right? That's like me going, I'm not going to teach anymore. I'm going to go get a job as a police officer, for example, and work the night shift, right? Like that would be such an incoherent decision that it's just crazy, right? So that kind of thing, right? It's incoherent decisions and incoherent internal processes, right? Both, coherence is an inner and outer phenomenon. Unlivable. So unlivable is pointing towards these types of things, right? Is that, if you are making a decision that one part of you feels is unlivable, like I just can't deal with it, eventually probably the decision will break down, or you will have to shut down some aspect of yourself so strongly that, it's like cutting off a piece of you, so to speak, or binding a piece of you very strongly. And there are weird circumstances in life that might force you to do that. People in war-torn countries, for example, they have to deal with that kind of thing, right? Like it happens, but don't do it to yourself, right? Basically, don't put yourself into unlivable decisions. And I've tried at times because of a sense of like, oh, my responsibilities say I should want to do this or whatever the case may be. And typically they don't work out, right? So make sure that you can live with whatever decision you're making. That ties into undesired weight, right? If something feels too heavy, right, then that's also something that's typically means that that the structures in your life, right, that your infrastructure as a being can't handle it, right? That's different than weight, right? We all have weights to carry. And sometimes, undesired weight is thrust upon you by forces that you can't control. That happens. But again, don't do it to yourself if you can, right? With your decision making. It's like if you're making a decision where you're like, I'm going to take on undesired weight, then I'm going to suggest you either, change something inside of you so that it's not undesired, or better, don't do it, right? Fragmented. same thing, right? We're talking about, making decisions again that feel fragmented. Like parts of you are totally on board and parts of you are completely and utterly against it. And it feels like there's a battle within. It's not a quiet resistance, it's a strong resistance. It's like, fuck this. So in that case, again, I would suggest not doing that if you can help it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit earlier, I talked about, anxious and needing certainty. So that kind of like, I'm going to think about this and think about this and think about this forever, and analyze and analyze and analyze, and a lot of mental processing is typically a sign that you're in unskillful decision-making territory, because it's wanting certainty. And my friend, there is no such thing as certainty. And the best we can do is to stack things in our favor at the level of probability, really. And to direct that stacked in favorness towards a particular outcome, right? That's it. And so if you were truly needing certainty, you're in the wrong domain, because for one, the mind, most decisions that are super major are too big for the mind to fully process, right? The human mind, in terms of the rational, measuring one thing against another thing, pros and cons, information gathering, let's do this, like that in and of itself is super limited, right? The other than conscious mind, what people call the unconscious or the subconscious, has a lot more bandwidth and capacity to make big decisions. And you don't get there with overthinking stuff. You just don't, right? The other than conscious mind, the deep mind, one could say, will speak to you in a very different way. Typically, what you're going to encounter are images, sounds, and feelings, right? They are archetypal, right? Archetypal elements are not super languagey. Like, they don't come out in paragraphs and sentences and mental dialogues. They come out as forces that are primal. So keep that in mind, right? So taken together, those are the qualities that can point you towards potentially making unskillful decisions. Okay, so now we're going to talk about centers and aim. And a center is actually something that is critical for coherence. Because when we're thinking about coherence, it's very easy to imagine and orientate towards the peripheral, in the sense that we are looking at what is coming into resonance with each other, but not necessarily what is coming into resonance around, what the coherence is occurring around. So think about, for example, a solar system, our solar system. Everything coheres around the sun, yeah? Now also think about a body, for example, and how everything coheres around the center of gravity, or what might be called the lower dantian in Chinese cultures, or the hara in Japanese cultures, or the svadhisthana chakra in like Vedic traditions, for example. We're talking about this center in the body that the body coheres around, and that's what we would in some sense call the core. Core and center in this way are pretty synonymous with each other, yeah? So when we're talking about coherence, we're also talking about a center. Now, when it comes to decision making, it's important to keep centers in mind, because they are orientation points. They are the stance that we take towards the world. Now, we're going to talk about centers in the context of the head, the heart, and the gut, which can be extrapolated to the 7 chakras, for example. Like if you wanted to make them a little bit more complex, the 7 chakra model in some ways is reflective of a 3 center model. It's just that there's more nuance around them. But nonetheless, right, you could make decisions from the head, from the heart, from the gut, right? And you could make decisions from a single chakra, for example. Power chakra, the solar plexus, will want to make a different kind of decision than, let's say, the throat chakra. Now, when we're thinking about coherence, though, and center, ideally, right? Ideally, you have a unified, whole being, central axes of experience, right? In the sense that the head, the heart, and the gut are synchronized together in the decision-making process, and or, right, that one or two of these centers can willingly give way to one of the centers taking over for a decision that exists within its domain. We'll talk about this more in a couple of slides. But for now, center in this point is referring to the stance and the orientation that we are taking when we are in the decision-making process, right? Where are we orientating from? And this is a really valuable thing, right? Because a center point can easily be taken over, so to speak, by a part inside of you, yeah? One way to think about it, and this is getting a little bit esoteric, but that everything is fractal. So every single center could potentially be the center. Only one center exists from that perspective. So in that way, the center inside of a part of you might become the focal point that then hijacks a decision. So we're going to talk about that more in a practical way when we get there, but it's one of the ways in which you might center yourself in a particular part that chooses a trajectory that is not in favor of the whole, but is aligned with its aim. And that's going to lead us into the next piece, which is aim. Yeah. So this aim is about establishing the North Star. So we take a stance as a being. Yeah. And we are centered, hopefully, in ourselves, and we have coherence inside the system where our different major sort of epicenters, like the head, the heart, and the gut, are synchronized enough with each other to then take an aim at something in life and allow for everything about you to come together in a congruent fashion to move towards that aim. Yeah, so I know that a little bit of what I was saying might be really theoretical in this particular slide, but hopefully that starts to tie it together. Yeah, is that if we are centered enough to create coherence inside our system and then bring that together to move towards an aim, then that's, again, a major aspect of high quality decision making. And that also means establishing an aim. Right? A very clear aim in life, or multiple aims that are all resonant with each other, like a cluster of focus. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, right? But it's that idea, which is pointed out here, that's a Zen saying that if you want your ship to go north, point it north. And I've said this before, but it's a useful thing to keep in mind, right? Because a lot of times people will start to make really impulsive and reactive decisions that aren't centered, so to speak, in the greater unity of the whole, and the aim isn't clear. So what we do want is to establish a center, right, of focus, of stance, of orientation, establish a center, then point it towards a North Star, right? That is straightforward here. That means that you cohere your system and your choices around the center and the North Star. Yeah? Think about an archer taking aim, in the proper stance, pointed exactly at what they want, with a bullseye in mind, and they let it go, and they have faith that the arrow will make it to the target, right? Depending on all of these factors, how the structure was aligned or not, whether everything inside of them was pointed towards that center or not, will determine whether the arrow hits the bullseye. And that's what this notion is pointing towards. So again, we'll tie this together a little bit more in practice moving forward. But for now, I wanted to point out this hexagram, which I got right as I was preparing to record this course, which is really great. Hexagrams are the omens, so to speak, that arise out of the book called the I Ching. For those of you who don't know, there are 6 lines that are binary. So lines are either open or they're closed, they're yin or they're yang, and a combination of yin and yang across 6 lines gives you one of 64 hexagrams. So if you're familiar with that already, then you know what I'm talking about. If you're not, that's the basic understanding, but really interesting. So Zong often refers, and I'm butchering the pronunciation because I don't speak Chinese, but Zong refers to the center, right? And there's a term called Zongding in Chinese martial arts, which refers to an actual center from the top of your head to your perineum, literally a central axis throughout the whole body, like a pole that contains within it the 3 dantians, which are the head, the heart, and the gut, or the physical body is showing you what is occurring at an energetic level with the head, the heart, and the gut, right? So the dantians are really energetic centers that are resonant with the physical expression at the level of matter with those zones, right? But that's not the point. I'm going to go ahead and read you this because I thought it was fascinating and it really points to what we're talking about here. So Zong, or centering, is another term that permeates the ancient ritual world. It means moving to or being at the center, an equal or still point between opposites. It is an arrow that hits the center of the target, the equinoxes, the pivotal points of the year. It is the coming in and going out of the souls from the center, the heart and its inner animation, the activity of the Shen or spirits in the heart and their harmonizing influence. It refers to the inner world, meditation, and the inner way, putting something to the trial through divination. The root is a banner placed at the center point of the 4 sides, a hole or link to the world of the dead and the ancestors. So this actually completely ties together what we've been talking about. For those of you who don't know, Shen is referring to one's consciousness, fundamentally, the soul consciousness of the being, but also each of our organs, so to speak, has a Shen. Shen will also just refer to spirit as like a general overall term. It's a multifaceted thing, right? So when we're talking about the activity of the Shen, or the spirits in the heart and their harmonizing influence, we're talking about this total inner coherence of each of the organs inside of you having its own consciousness that is feeding into the whole and cohering around and being governed by the heart Shen, which is the heart organ spirit. This is a core aspect of Chinese thought, right? In regards to the human being. That's a really simplified version of it. But for right now, it's simply pointing towards this notion of, a central point that everything else coheres around, that takes aim towards something, and that takes into account the spirit world as well, not just the physical world and what makes sense, in order to find alignment, yeah? So, very good hexagram that I thought was very poignant for this. Okay, so now moving on to this idea of polymorphic centers. So polymorphic is a Greek term. It means having many forms. One thing that can appear, behave, or operate as multiple forms without losing its identity. It means stable at the core, flexible at the edges. There is a center that persists while the surface adapts. Yeah? So this is a way to think about having a center that is fundamentally shifting from epicenter to epicenter in a sense, right? So the head, the heart, and the gut are a great example of a three-centered being that is actually talking about one center. Because at a deeper level of the energetics, those three aspects of our decision-making faculties, those three centers of intelligence, the head, the heart, and the gut, are like bandwidths. They're frequencies that exist in one center, which is the central channel, so to speak, that everything arises from and returns to in the context of how an organism is energetically structured. Yeah. One way to think about that is just that they are different faculties of the same single being. If all this talk about, different energetics is a little bit confusing for you, then just think about a being that has multiple centers of intelligence that all belong to one interconnected, unified whole, right? One organism, one entity. So polymorphic in this way is referring to each of these centers representing a different kind of orientating process within the context of the whole organism. And this is really important because parts, right, the parts we've been talking about, all these different parts that might hijack your decision-making process or, that are feeding into your decision-making process are all fractal representations of the whole of you, right? So each part is its own self-contained microcosm of you, meaning that each one might have its own orientation of more energy in head, heart, or gut. Think about it like this, right? So there are parts of you that are very cognitively focused. When they come into dominance inside your system where they are giving you feedback, they're very cognitively orientated, yeah? And they resonate more with your head as an energetic center. Now, the same thing could be said for the heart and the belly. So parts of you that are very physically orientated and that come into more dominance when you're doing like certain kinds of physical practices or whatever the case may be, might have a lot more energy in the belly, so to speak. And, we're talking about energetic points of focus here, right? That are fractally represented across the whole of you as an energetic system. Now, what does that mean at a practical level? So what it means at a practical level is that your head, your heart, and your gut are major orientating centers when you're making decisions, and that each has a different kind of information that it feeds you about a particular phenomenon or a particular path that you are considering. So the head will orientate primarily towards rational forms of thinking, information in a very cognitive context, right? Strategy and tactics that are also very cognitive. Words, so, sentences and paragraphs, so to speak. Learning many different kinds of information, measuring one thing against another thing, right? Pros and cons. It's how most people think of as of proper decision making in today's world, right? Very cognitive. And this tells you a lot about our culture, that as a culture, we are very head orientated as a culture. So that is the kind of information and the way that the head orientates as a center. Now, the heart is more emotional, and the heart is something that will typically move into an emotive context. How does it feel about it emotionally and relationally? So the heart will often think about things, it's a type of thinking, right? I mean, it's also not, thinking here, but it is a kind of emotive thinking and processing that is very concerned with the way that things affect the the transpersonal sphere. Yeah. So, am I sad about this? Am I happy about this? Do I have grief about this, or am I excited about this? Is there a spark of joy here, or does it feel, like I really don't want to do this, right? There's all these kinds of emotions that emerge in the heart space. And then also, how do other people feel about this? And how will this affect the way that other people feel about this? And it measures relationship and relationality in a very different way. The heart is also a place that can hold context between the head and the gut, but we'll get there. So the gut is going to focus much more on primal and or primitive orientations and what we might call a gut sense of things. Yeah. So the gut in that way is more of a creature. It's way more of a creature than the heart and the head in terms of orientation. I mean, it's very kinetic and very kinesthetic, and its feelings are much more, straightforward, right? Whereas emotive feelings can be very, very nuanced, right? When we're, like, let's say, in a relationship with a partner, and all these different feelings emerge, and all these different things can be felt. The gut has much more of a attraction, aversion, a yes, a no. This feels good. This doesn't feel good. I want this, I don't want this, right? It's an animal moving through its environment and its context. So the gut is also the oldest of the centers, right? The gut actually came first as a center. So in today's world, we'll often think about the head and the heart as brain 1 and 2, and that's just an artifact of the modern world, right? From evolutionary biology standpoint, the gut came first. So because creatures started off on the ocean floor as worms, as worm-like creatures, which were basically a digestive tract fundamentally, which still exists literally inside of us. This worm, so to speak, that is centered, so to speak, at the gut area, moving from the mouth of the anus, right? So the gut has this deep ancestral intelligence about it, and it's very, very, very resonant with the other than conscious mind or the deep mind. So it can make sense of a lot of very different phenomenon, which is why people often say follow your gut. So this whole idea, right, of centers is actually found in language. It's follow your head, right? Have a good head on your shoulders. Be cool-headed. Or follow your heart. What does your heart want? Or follow your gut. What does your gut want? And often people will mix these things up, right? They'll confuse head and heart, and these things are because people don't realize that we are actually talking about polymorphic centers, right? That there are multiple centers that are all aspects of one phenomenon that are giving different kinds of information and are capable of doing different kinds of things. Now, the best decisions emerge out of, the head, the heart, and the gut all being in alignment together. That doesn't mean that they're equally contributing to a specific outcome, because some decisions don't require your head, some don't require your gut, some don't require your heart. But there's congruence between all of these different layers of your being, right? The mental side of something makes sense. The emotive side of something makes sense. The gut level aspect of something makes sense, right? So that's one way to orientate about this. Now, let's take a different example and move towards, let's say chakras, right? So again, if you were to center all of your decisions out of, let's say, the solar plexus, which is the chakra associated with power, that means that your overall focus in life would become very power focused, yeah? That would be the primary center of decision making. I'm orientating from a place of power. So that's all I see. That's all I understand. It's who has more power, right? And let me get power, or whatever, right? Whatever the case may be. Versus someone who's centered in the heart, right? We've even heard that term, a heart-centered being, right? So a heart-centered being will, again, make decisions from the heart, yeah? So I hope you're starting to get a sense of what I'm talking about when I refer to centers and how they orientate us upon decisions. Now, again, ideally, what you want is actually a congruence, coherence of the centers together so that you have more of you that can come together in the process of decision making. Yeah? So that's one thing to keep in mind. And learning to identify when one center is resisting what you're doing, right? What doesn't like what's happening, or listening for when one center is very clearly saying, "Hey, this is the thing," without getting interference from the other centers, right? Cultivating the different centers, right? Cultivating your mind, right? Learning, basically, right? Cultivating your heart, working at an emotive layer, and doing emotional hygiene work, right? And working on the heart mind. And if you don't have the heart mind is a term from Chinese medicine that refers to this emotive processing intelligence of the heart, fundamentally. So if you don't have a methodology for that, look for shape-shifting stories that's in the Soul Forge, because that's super helpful methodology for tending to the heart mind when it's needed. But there are many ways to do that. That's not exhaustive. It's a very useful method. Cultivating the body and physical experience, right? So that you have your different centers tended to, clean, so to speak, to some degree or another, right? Not as perfectly purified, right? That's not the point. So that they can all contribute to the decision-making process and that you have more totality behind what you do. Okay. Okay, so now that we discussed this idea of polymorphic centers, let's talk about layered north stars, which are kind of the same thing, more or less, in a manner of speaking, in the sense that if the polymorphic centers was the aspect of getting centered and taking a stance and orientation towards the world, then the layered north stars are the bullseyes that take the aim, so to speak, of the arrow that we are launching. Yeah. So there are a lot of things that could fit into this notion of a layered north star, right? What we're looking for in this way is more like a constellation, so to speak, right? Like if there was a northern constellation as opposed to a single star. Or maybe if you wanted to like exhaust this metaphor for the fun of it, we could say that the North Star, wherever that is actually the sun of a solar system, right? Or something like that. And that we're really pointing towards this whole cluster of planetary bodies, right? And stellar phenomenon. But really, we're talking about North Stars that have that are layered, right? So that there's multiple aspects that are all congruent with each other, so that we're pointing towards either one, and that moving towards either one moves us towards all of them. Yeah? So this is incredibly helpful, and one of the ways to stay adaptable, because if we are super narrowly focused on one particular thing, we start to miss how complex reality actually is, and we start to lose our ability to focus and adapt, and also to acknowledge the different aspects of us and how they all want the same thing in different ways. Yeah? So this is what I mean by a layered North Star, is that you want the same thing, but they kind of show up in different ways. Right? So think about it like this, what does everything about you want? Probably at some level deep down, if you were to get to the core of it without all of the stuff that we throw on it, is most of you wants to thrive. Yeah? Like you want to blossom and flourish. This is a core quality of living creatures, and you want to be fortunate, yeah? And what that looks like is going to be different for different aspects of you and for different parts of your life. You know, what is thriving at a mental level versus an emotional level versus, you know, a physical level. And of course, can you thrive truly if all those aspects of you aren't thriving, right? It's a layered North Star to thrive, right? Thriving also is congruent, so to speak, with destiny, right? That we're moving towards our destiny as a creature, towards this culmination, right? This fruiting, so to speak, of what's possible for us as a being. And, you know, giving our contribution. You actually can't thrive without also being in line with your unique contribution, because, you know, your contribution emerges fully out of your thriving, ideally. Yeah, like the full contribution you can make emerges out of the fullness of your thriving, right? Because contribution is like the fruit on a tree. Yeah. Now the quality of that fruit is going to be dependent on the health of the tree. So all that's together, right? Auspiciousness. Auspiciousness is a beautiful term. It refers to, you know, this general overall good auspices, so to speak, right? That things are fortunate for you, that that your soul is being nourished and fed by the process, that there is a sense of enchantment and enlightening quality to your life, that it is moving towards this vibrant, you know, spacious aliveness, right? It's a beautiful term with a lot of different meanings to it, but all of that is super congruent with thriving in destiny, but in a sense different, yeah? But congruent, you know, and then coherence, coherent. All of that we've spoken about earlier, coherence as a North Star is fantastic, right? It's continuously moving towards coherence as a process. And if things are coherent, then you'll definitely, you typically move towards thriving, and coherence is in line with destiny and auspiciousness. It's very different. It's very difficult for things to be super incoherent and for you to be thriving, moving towards your destiny, and for things to be auspicious, yeah? So all of these things cohere together. And I want to flesh this out in a little bit of a different way. And that is principles that you have about life. They can be and are often a North Star. You know, principles that help establish a way through life is a way to measure your actions against, right? Your values, the things that are truly important to you fundamentally, that aren't connected to should, have to, must, but want to and love to and get to. Those kinds of feelings that emerge from within your own values. And then, of course, outcomes, right? Like an outcome being, I want to get to this particular zone of thriving. I want to be able to live in alignment with my destiny. I want to be able to have an auspicious life. I want a coherent life, right? Those are kinds of outcomes. And all these things can unify together to become a layered North Star, where you want principles that are in alignment with your thriving. Because you could easily find principles that are not. Certain Christian principles of, you know, the notion of original sin and having to repent and, you know, beating yourself senseless, you know, whipping yourself because you're a priest who thinks that you have to do that. Like, that's principle that is not in alignment with thriving, auspiciousness, destiny, coherence, typically. So the principles we have in that way are either contributing or not, right? Same thing with your values. You're either moving towards your values and prioritizing them, or you're not. And all of that is related to different kinds of outcomes. So none of this is meant to be like, this is exactly it. It's layered. And I want to orientate you towards these layers. So now, here's the fun thing, right? So a big part of all of this is the continuous work that is to be done to get centered and have an aim that points towards layered north stars, right? And figuring out what those layers are for you. Right here, you can see 4 of my major ones, right? Which are thriving, destiny, auspiciousness, coherent. And I'm always orientating towards these things, right? It's just like an instinct at this point. And within that, I'm typically, taking stock of principles, values, and how that's affecting outcomes, etc. And I can point towards any one of these things at any point. I can ask divination questions that have to do with thriving, or destiny, or auspiciousness, or coherence, or what is auspicious and coherent, right? Any and all of these things, in terms of bringing them to your divination questions, pointing towards them with aim, is great, because they're all going to take you more or less to the same place, to the same land, the same territory. Okay. All right, so now that we've established like this enormous context, now I want to give you a little bit of a refinement in terms of a map on the different kinds of choices that you can make. Now, again, because in our culture, because we don't have really awesome maps around high quality decision making, it's easy for us to get lost in the jungle, so to speak, of different kinds of choices without recognizing that we're making different kinds of choices. And this is very true at a mythic, archetypal, and energetic level, right? There are different kinds of mythic stories, different kinds of energies that do different things, right? So, consolidation of energy, right? Think of something consolidating energetically in nature is a very different than something evaporating and distilling, yeah? So there are different kinds of energies. And at one level, everything we are doing is energy moving at some point or another, right? So, and different kinds of energy moving, not some nebulous, monotheistic sense of like homogenized energy. It's no, different kinds of energetic charges are doing different things, and different choices are aligned with different kinds of energies. And archetypally, of course, at an archetypal level, right, there's very broad strokes of different kinds of choices, which can be outlined here. Or even find that in like the hero's journey, where, each one of the stages of the hero's journey is a different kind of energetic phenomenon, a different set of choices. Yeah. So the same is true here, right? I want to give you a little bit of a map and a model for you to have if this kind of thing is valuable for you when you're trying to orientate. It has been for me at times. And I actually had to mine this from my own experience and go over the many different kinds of choices that I have struggled with, because I definitely have had my own struggles around choices, which is why this course emerged, right? It's been extracted from my own experience. So, basic, do I start, right? So starting, do I begin something? Do I go to school, right? Do I get this gym membership, right? Do I begin doing this small thing, right? Do I begin using this kind of thumbnail for my videos, right? Do I start? Pretty straightforward. That's one way to orientate. So also, kind of a little bit of a cheat code here, right? This is a super helpful thing to keep in mind with divination, right? Which is one of the arts I strongly suggest, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit, yeah. But I've already pointed out why divination can be very helpful, and there will be a divination, if I haven't mentioned it already, there will be a divination module, 1 or 2, in the future. So, yeah. Next is a crossroad. So, which direction do I take, right? Sometimes these have to do with starts, right? These things can overlap, but for the sake of keeping like clean hygiene with this, let's just, you're already started on some process, you're on a road and you encounter a fork, right? Do I take this path or do I take that path, right? Crossroads are different in the sense of just starting to, because you're being faced with a very clear this or that, right? Which direction do I go in? And it usually feels like you could go in either, and that either has the potential to move you towards, a North Star, right? So which direction do I take? Wait, that's a big one. Do I not do anything? Do I just sit back and wait and allow for something to emerge? It's kind of like being in the woods and you're about to move into a clearing and step out of a tree line, but you see a giant bear walking across. That's like, just wait. Be patient, allow for things to emerge, right? Don't do anything. So, or do I not wait, right? So that's one of the things you have to kind of like keep in mind is, maybe do I wait? Do I not wait? Continue, right? That's when you're already on a particular track and maybe you start to run into resistance or something no longer is feeling right or whatever. And the question is, do I continue with this path, right? Do I stay on track and just wait things out, right, until something shifts, etc., right? Or do I change some kind of focus maybe? That would be return, right? Return is what I would think of more as like refinement and like going back over your steps again, right? When something is not working out, when something doesn't really make sense anymore, when you're running into resistance, it's like backtracking, so to speak. Do I backtrack? Do I refocus? Do I refine? Maybe, right? Return. You hear, refocus, refine, return. These are all words that are, talking about the same kind of energetic motion. Yeah. And it just means having to go over something again and again in order to change it, right? So, you might start on a path, then, you hit a crossroad at some point, and then you have to make a decision, and then you run into like something that you're unsure about. You might have to wait. Then the message is, I continue forward. Yeah. And then maybe something happens and you get lost, so to speak. You're not sure about direction anymore. You need to return. It means you need to backtrack. You need to maybe refine something, refocus your work somehow, and then finally end. Do I end this? Do I stop this? Do I get off this journey, so to speak? Or has it just arrived? Is it time to allow this to end, or have I reached the end? Right? And so all of these are actually talking about navigating, right, through a particular terrain, so to speak, and moving through life. Yeah. And they represent different kinds of choices that we encounter on the journey of life, so to speak, right? To get a little bit cliche about it. The journey of life. Yeah. So these kinds of choices are what we encounter. And I wanted to give them to you to give you a map of where you might be at a particular junction, right? At a particular point in your life. And some decision that you're considering, some big decision that you might be considering, it's like, it can often fit into one of these. I mean, is this completely exhaustive? No. But it's broad enough that it can be mostly useful to just about almost any decision, to give you a map to orientate upon. And like I said, divination, right? Different kinds of divination questions, like school. Do I go to school? Start. Simple. Which school do I go to? Crossroad, right? Do I wait to get a response, or do I start going after another one? Right? Do I continue going to school? Right? School doesn't make sense anymore. I don't like what I'm doing. Do I backtrack, maybe choose a different major? Right? Do I keep going for my PhD, or do I end my school? Right? So it's a very straightforward example of what I mean by how we orientate in the context of a long arc and decision-making process. Okay, now I want to point you towards what I like to call special considerations in the context of this course, right? And we've all encountered these kinds of things, and I have run into them way more often than I would like to admit. And sometimes they have to get really loud for us to pay attention, to the point where they create some serious disruptions in our lives because we're not getting the message. Sometimes, though, we aren't ready for the message, and the disruption is when the system is ready to get it, right? In the sense that this had been happening, I hadn't noticed it, and now I do. And that means that now it's time to figure out what it means, so to speak, and how to potentially shift it. Now, this is all summed up really succinctly in a quote by Carl Jung, which is this: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So we've talked a lot about fate here, and that's a really important consideration. And this is connected to probability patterns and things that have an established momentum to them typically, right? So established momentum typically means, or can mean, a repeating pattern, yeah? So a pattern that keeps showing up over and over and over again. And I mean this in a way that has a particular quality to it, because if anything, thriving is a pattern, right? Moving towards destiny, auspiciousness, coherence, these are patterns. So if anything, we want patterns, and we want to pattern ourselves in ways that are aligned with everything we've been talking about here. Ideally, yeah, I mean, I don't want to tell you what to do, but I'm pretty sure that if you're listening to this course, to some degree, you want that, right? So with that said, right, patterns are important, but I'm talking about a particular kind of pattern. That's a pattern that has this sense of a perceived rut, of molting or itchiness. And molting is when an animal that sheds is ready to shed, like a snake. And it's trying to let go of a particular layer, and it gets uncomfortable, right? Molting carries with it a sense of itchiness, discomfort to it, right? It's like, I'm kind of ready for this to be done, and to move into my new skin, so to speak. And stalled progress is also a big one. We just keep running into some kind of a block over and over and over again. In magical traditions, this would be called crossed conditions, maybe. Yeah, the things are simply at cross purposes with each other. You're tangled up. There's not a flow. You're stuck, basically, in the muck. It's all metaphors to describe a similar kind of phenomenon. And typically, the source of these patterns is unconscious. Hence, unless you make the conscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, right? All these things are talking about an interconnected phenomenon. It's layers of reality that are patterned a certain way, that have a momentum to them, that may have existed even before you were born, and that are perpetuating a particular way of life that feels like it's too limited and too small for the organism, so to speak. Or, this is a big or, that the organism is resisting some layer of fate that it simply can't truly escape. Because whether you like it or not, there are things in life that cannot be escaped. They are simply a matter of reality. And so what those are versus what this kind of like I can shift this kind of pattern is really a very nuanced issue that is something I can't give you an easy map for in the context of this particular course. If the principles solidify and crystallize for me at some point and the spirits have feedback about it, I might do a course on it. But for now, something you kind of have to just be able to come up on your own, right? And measure it against some of what's already been given here. But these kinds of things often are pointing towards a special consideration. So, meaning that they're information that is valuable, right? When you see it showing up again, and again, it means pay attention, right? And it's potentially pointing you towards a block that is either internal or external, or both, right? So if it's internal, it's figuring out what that block is and figuring out what to shift around it, right? What kind of a set of decisions wants to be made around it? Maybe a new set of practices. Maybe it's letting go of certain practices. Maybe it's, getting on a new trajectory. Maybe it is getting off of a current trajectory. Maybe it's bringing back something into your life that you had let go of. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's some kind of fragmentation or wounding or trauma that needs to be healed. Maybe it's some pattern that has to be alchemized, whatever the case may be. But if this keeps showing up again and again and again, I would pay attention and consider it an important part of how to move forward with this material. All right, my friends. So now we're getting to nitty-gritty practice stuff. And we're going to discuss what this looks like in action. And by this point, this slide ought to not be something that you would require to be super exhaustive, right? If you've really been paying attention, then a lot of this stuff should be really obvious once I point it out to you. So let's just dive in, right? Wayfinding and the practices for doing so. So let's take a look at 4 different major arcs that we can put into actual practice. So the first would be triggering deep knowing. Now, this is something that can take on many different forms. And it's often best to know what triggers deep knowing for you in the context of your established life already. Yeah? I mean, can you adopt some of these things if you haven't been doing them? Of course. But I'm not specifically saying that you have to. It's actually better to have 1 or 2 of these that you are solid in already, that you have an established practice around, than it is to try to do them all at once. Can you work with all of these? Yes, you can. And I do. But I have cultivated each one over time, right? I'm not jumping into this tomorrow and expecting myself to have all of this figured out. And it's not really necessary because what you want is simply to have a reliable way to trigger that sense of deep knowing. Now, to say it cleanly and clearly, if you know, you know. And if you don't, you don't. Right? So deep knowing is not like, do I know? That's not the question. If you have to ask, then you don't. Deep knowing is clear and straightforward. And you know, right? So one of the best ways to do this is to get into flow state. So deep flow, and I have taught about flow in this, in the Substack membership here. There's a course on it called 6 Degree Flow in the SoulForge. Which is a specific flow practice. If you don't feel like doing that specific flow practice, then what you can ideally do is just go through that presentation to learn about how flow works and then find ways for you to get into flow for yourself. So different kinds of flow practices are, well, that flow practice that I shared. Also Tai Chi, for example, or Baguazhang, right? Like the Chinese martial arts that do have a choreography to them that allow you to get into flow. Ecstatic dance, doing parkour out in nature, having amazing sex with a loving partner, chanting, for example. All of these can pull you into deep flow. Now, deep flow is super helpful as a process because it essentially requires your whole system to unify and become coherent in order for you to enter into flow. And I won't teach about that again because I've already taught about it here, but flow is a unification practice, and very importantly, it pulls you deeply into the present moment, which allows you to undo the time fragmentation we were talking about earlier. So getting into flow can help you trigger deep knowing, right? And you don't have to connect these things together, right? You can just get into flow on a regular basis. And if there's a decision that you're having trouble making, getting into flow regularly might help you make it. Maybe not on its own, And we'll talk about how to connect all these together into one unified whole in the next slide to end this course. So same thing, body as oracle, right? So meaning that you can ask your body simple yes or no questions and that it can give you a response. This is a method often called like a body pendulum method, right? Like a pendulum is something that swings back forward and back, giving you clear yes or no answers. And one way to do this is, to ask your body, is my name Ramon, right? And see, and if your name is Ramon, then that might make sense for you, right? Ask it your name, and then see what the response is, how it feels. You'll get a yes, right? If you're asking your true name, then ask, is my name some other name? And you'll get a no. And that gives you like a baseline for yes and no answers. So what you do then is that once you have a clear baseline established, you start to ask your body yes or no. Super helpful, can be mistaken because bodies today are, dealing with all the stuff we've already been talking about: trauma, fragmentation, mixed signals, all that stuff, right? So not infallible, but still very helpful. And especially if you have practices that are continuously working with the body to help get it more coherent, then even more so. Prayer, right? Prayer is stepping outside of your current faculties. Like, it's connecting to a more expansive power grid. So in a sense of, I can't solve this on my own. I need help. So you connect to some other force through spoken word, probably, to ask for help. And prayer can absolutely trigger deep knowing. People have done this for eons. Well, eon is actually, I've recently learned that eon means billions of years. It's a word I really like, but probably not eons. Millennia, right? People have done this for a very long time. Ritual. So ritual, as I said earlier, connects you to forces beyond, again, similar to prayer, beyond your limited sense of self, and can connect you to archetypal patterns, right? So some kind of a ritual that you understand and makes sense, whether it's a banishing ritual, it's a reclaiming of something ritual, it's a blessing ritual, it's some other ritual that, has nothing to do with that. That's just something that helps get you centered and focused and clear, right? It can absolutely trigger deep knowing. Magic, doing magical processes around a particular outcome that you want, right? So practical magic, which I've talked about before, for getting something done. You do the magic and you wait for the deep knowing to emerge. Pretty simple. Unification practices, similar to flow, but if you have something that you work with that is, balancing all of your chakras together, so to speak, in one, long practice, that you're unifying these different threads together, for example, or some equivalent thereof, absolutely valuable. Again, getting centered, getting coherent, getting everything kind of feeding into each other, clearing up static and dissonance between parts and aspects of self and centers. And of course, listening and waiting, right? Just listening and waiting. And hoping to get the sense of deep knowing. All of these are viable ways to get that sense of like, I know what to do. Next is divination. And I mentioned divination a lot, and I strongly suggest having a divination practice. Straightforward and no ands or buts about it, right? Of course, you're an adult, do what you want, but humans have divined for as long as humans have been humans, and every culture has divination methods because it's a part of being human to divine, right? It's super, super, super natural. Not only that, but humans are designed to divine, right? We're doing it all the time. Right now, if I were to put a little ball, like a golf ball, on the desk, and I were to push the ball towards someone on the other side, immediately their mind would start to predict what's going to happen, right? And they would stick out their hand to grab the ball. And if they were a functioning human, they probably would be able to do it for the most part. That was a predictive process. It's a divining process. But even beyond that super practical example, the reason that divination shows up in every culture is because it's already a part of being human. If not, it couldn't, right? So divination is super valuable, and this can look like anything, right? Any type of divination method that works for you. So tarot, runes, the I Ching, playing cards, some of the African oracles, if you know how to engage with them, building a bone oracle. All of these methods work if the parameters are in place. And the parameters are that the oracle is linked to some kind of a spiritual principle or force or being, right? And that you're working with that principle, force, or being to get a broader perspective. But divination covers a lot of things. I won't go over all of it again because I've already talked about it multiple times here. Next is counsel, right? So trusted advisors, people who you know have your best interest at heart, or who have a lot of experience in a particular domain that you are wanting to make a decision around, right? Pretty straightforward. Trusted advisors, people who love you or people who have a lot of experience in a particular field of knowledge. Same thing here in terms of conversation, right? Like having important conversations with people that fit these kinds of parameters, right? Or even conversations that just open you up and help you understand things at a broader level, or at a more nuanced level, because they have a way of triggering insight and enlightenment, so to speak, satori, insight into you, into reality for you. Some people will do that. Teachers, of course, right? Similar, not necessarily the same, but going to teachers that you trust, that you know have knowledge and skill within a particular orientation and field of knowledge. And then engaging with them, seeing what they have to say. Modeling would be another one, right? You look for an established pathway between where you're at and where you want to go that you know works, and that you then start to model some of that. It's basically, that's like wayfinding through a city. You know that, or even through like a terrain, right? Through a trail. That's like an established trail that says like, hey, to go from A to B, if you want to do that, this is a guaranteed, well, it's close to guaranteed because you could run into, a mountain lion that could eat you, right? Or break a leg on the way there, for example. But this is a path, a trail that leads from A to B. And that ties into strategy, right? It's strategy and tactics can be useful when they are proven and clear, and they coincide with deep knowing, right? If you're exploring a strategy and tactic, you're like, man, that makes sense. That's what I would suggest going with. But, this is the council of elders, so to speak, that you can work with. And then finally, allowing, right, would be another strategy, which is going with the flow. This would be more of like the Taoist principle of Wu Wei, which is like effortless effort, which is allowing things to unfold without contriving them, without pushing them. A viable strategy, so to speak, in life under some circumstances, or if this is like one of your kind of major themes in life, it could be a big orientating principle for you. Or faith in God, right? Some equivalent of that. Some equivalent of faith in a higher principle. The universe has your back, so to speak. Like all these kinds of ways of allowing the broader forces of life to unfold for you without you necessarily needing to direct them on purpose or to make some kind of decision around them. What's interesting, of course, is that, you could have a practice that kind of triggers a deep knowing, where everything, it's also in divination and counsel says allow, right? For example, that could happen. So, all these things can get together. And if you have something that allows all of these things to come together, then that's a really solid decision, right? So if you have a really big decision in life, something major and critical, then my suggestion would be, working on triggering deep knowing, doing divination around it, getting counsel, and then seeing what is there, right? If you're getting mixed signals, then means do more focusing, right, around it, practice. If you're not just in allowing, go with the flow mode, then it means that something is off somewhere, right? When you get green lights everywhere, that's a solid signal. Okay, and finally, we arrive at a way to kind of connect all of these together into one simple, unified whole practice. If you really need it, right? And this is just a suggestion. If you require it and if it makes sense to you, this is not a prescription. It is a possibility, so to speak, for you if it makes sense. And I have used this method and I have taught this method to other people, and it's very effective. And that is to get into deep flow somehow, right? And that could be done in any of the ways we've already spoken about. It doesn't have to be any particular kind of practice. It just has to get you into flow. From that state of flow, so this is, something that's done back to back to back in one session. From that state of I just got into deep flow, which has all of these qualities of cohering the whole system, bringing you into the present moment, so clearing up this time fragmentation stuff, putting trauma on the back burner, so to speak, because right after deep flow, we typically have a deeper sense of possibility in terms of we're opened up to what we think we can actually accomplish in life. Then open your heart somehow. And the heart is the center between the head and the belly, right? It's literally between them. And so the heart also is thought to be the governor of all the organ spirits, as I mentioned earlier. And the heart is the central chakra between the 7 chakras, right? There's 3 at the bottom, 3 at the top, heart at the center, which is the marriage point of heaven and earth, or spirit and matter. The heart is, if you truly can't get clear, then the heart is one place to focus on, because it can give you more of a reliable signal than any other individual center, so to speak, on its own. So do some kind of practice to open your heart. There are many different ways to do that, and finding a method that works for you is key. And then divine. So literally, you sit into a divination session with one of your oracles. Get into deep flow, open your heart, divine. Very powerful combination. Then trust the answer, fundamentally, right? And then go with that, right? And if the answer makes sense, like truly, once you get the answer, and it's like, hey, this hit home, then that's something that I would burn the boats for, as they say, right? That was an old saying where Vikings would reach a particular land and burn the boats that they came on, to let people know they were serious, right? So this is a practice that I would trust. I would trust. If you don't trust it, then hey, you have to find your own way of doing this. But I wanted to give you something that has worked for me and has worked for other people, and that brings together all of these principles in a very straightforward way for the most part. The one thing that's left out of this is counsel. But this is something that you can do for yourself, because not everything requires external counsel. That's just one avenue for you to explore too, in the context of everything you're doing. So, all right, my friends, flow, open your heart, divine. And that is what I would call the core wayfinding practice as delivered in this course, but certainly not exhaustive, right? There's a lot that you could work with here that can just influence how you make decisions going in the future. All right, my friends, be well and take care, and thank you for joining me. Till next time.